First off, I'm a city kid. I don't know anything about land navigation or wilderness survival. And prior to that terrible day, the biggest forest I'd ever walked through was the park downtown. Things would have stayed that way too, if it wasn't for the weirdest text I'd gotten from my father right before I left work. It read in all caps. It was odd. My father was a university professor, and his texts were usually eye-rollingly long and grammatically perfect, but this... The message had come with a location pin, a single red dot surrounded by green. Zooming out, I saw that my father was in the middle of something called the Elijah Corvin Woods, a massive, privately run nature preserve a few hours outside of the city. There weren't any trails close to my father's location, and the nearest road seemed to be a long walk away. I wrote him back with a single question mark, but the message was left unread. I called twice, but he didn't pick up. I was irritated, but more than that, I was worried. My father, Dr. Ralph Stearns, had always been pretty, intense about his interests, but lately it had been one obsession after another. Ever since my mom had left him a few months earlier, he'd been going down some strange rabbit holes, hoping for a way to radically change his life. I had no idea what he could have been doing out there. Hiking? A meditation retreat? Maybe even something more dangerous, like searching for psychedelic mushrooms? With a groan, I put the coordinates he had sent me into my Maps app and stomped out the slush-covered office parking lot. In my blue polo shirt, khaki pants, and sneakers, I wasn't exactly prepared for a winter hike. My puffer jacket didn't do much to keep away the cold, and I had to blow on my hands to keep them warm while I started my car. The check engine light was on again, but there wasn't any time to do anything about that either. Like usual, it was nothing. Probably. I tried to ignore it and keep my mind on what I needed to do. Find my father, fix whatever he'd gotten himself into, and have a long talk with the old man about the dangers of getting too deep into your obsessions. At each stoplight, I pulled out my phone to look up information about the Elijah Corvin Woods. There wasn't much to be found. The website of the private foundation that managed to look exactly like something out of the early 90s. Like, it featured bright tie-dye colors, the name of the preserve, and a blurry photo of some of the trees. There were a few blog posts written by people who had visited, but they all felt a little unhinged. The posts began normally, describing the route the author took, what the forest looked like, or the motives for their journey. Most of the bloggers seemed to be into New Age stuff, or alternative spirituality, and they were visiting the Elijah Corvin Woods to connect with nature or receive healing energy. I had nothing against any of that, but the more I read, the more sinister those posts began to seem. The pattern was always the same. First, the sentences started to become incoherent. Next, the words spaced themselves out strangely, appearing in all caps, like some bizarre, creepy poem. Read one. Read another. A grotesque image of a person's toes transforming into bloody roots and digging themselves into the ground flashed through my mind, and I realized why the posts were bothering me so much. They were just like my father's text message. Equally unsettling was the fact that none of the blogs had been updated. The entry about the Elijah Corvin Woods was always the last post. Looking back, there were other details I should have noticed. Details that seemed minor at the time, but that would later take on a great and terrible importance. The most telling was that none of the authors of the 3 or 4 blogs I read seemed to be able to give the exact size of the nature preserve that they were visiting. Some claimed it was a small park, while other authors made it sound like they had been backpacking there for days. Pushing the uncomfortable possibilities out of my mind, I took my eyes off my phone and focused on getting to the preserve in one piece. I didn't see many cars on the road that led to Elijah Corvin Woods, and why would I? There was nothing out there but low, gray hills covered with endless forests. I saw no billboards, no rest areas, not even any wildlife. There was something ominous about those trees, though the way they seemed to be watching me from the crumbling edges of the snow-covered 2-lane road, I didn't like to think that my father might be lost somewhere out amongst them. The owners of the Elijah Corvin Woods, whoever they were, didn't exactly go out of their way to publicize the place. The park's bare-bones brown sign didn't list any contact information or visiting hours, and I found myself wondering exactly how my father had gotten access to it. There was no wall or fence around the preserve, it was much too large for that, but there was a barred gate at the end of the access road. It was wide open, with a single pair of tire tracks leading onward through the unplowed snow. The forest hovered over me, and my already small hatchback car felt tiny in its snow. I drove with gritted teeth, cringing every time my tires lost traction on the steep private drive. There was something hypnotic about the winding curves, the groaning of the wind in the bare branches, and the rumble of my four-cylinder engine as it struggled through the snow. If it hadn't been for the thing that ran out into the road, I might have driven past my father's car altogether. It was dark and ragged, moving so fast that it almost seemed to be flying. I slammed on the brakes, and my stomach lurched as my car slid forward sideways. It came to a halt with the tires still spinning, just inches away from going off the road entirely. With my heart thundering in my chest, I looked around for any trace of whatever it had been, but there was nothing, not even tracks in the snow. I caught sight of something else in a pull-off up ahead, a low, dark green shaped coasted, with a thin layer of powdery snow. It was my father's new sports car. I carefully parked beside it, switched off my engine, and stepped out into the freezing air. The woods were dead silent. I didn't like the quiet. It made me feel like something was standing right behind me, waiting for its chance to strike. The feeling was so intense, so overwhelming, that I couldn't bring myself to turn around and check. I was sure that if I did, I would see it. Some hollow-eyed, long-fingered thing, drool dribbling from its pin-like teeth. Then the sensation passed, and I was alone in the forest again. Maybe it was just the remoteness of the place, or the strangeness of my situation, but something about the Elijah Corvin woods had gotten to me. I took out my phone to see if I had service, only to find that the battery had gone dead, even though I would have sworn it was almost fully charged when I had left the office. My father's sports car was another trophy of the divorce. I didn't like to think about how much he'd paid for it, but at least it appeared to be intact. Footprints led away from its door and into the woods. I knew that without my phone, I'd have no way to call for help if I got lost. So I made a promise to myself. If I hadn't found any trace of my father after 10 minutes, I'd leave the preserve and let the authorities handle it. I would stick to the trail and keep the road in sight at all times. There wasn't much of a trail. If it hadn't been for the footprints, I would not have had any idea where the path lay. Something was off about my father's tracks, too. At times, they bunched together, stretched out, or even dispersed completely. At first, I wondered if they had been affected by the snow, but then I remembered that the last snowfall had been over 2 days ago. A chilling thought struck me. If that was the case, then why was my father's car snow-covered as well? Just how long had he been out there? I felt a sudden, burning need to look back, to confirm that my memory was correct. When I did, I saw nothing but mere forest. It shouldn't have been possible. I had only been walking for a few minutes. The road had been right behind me the whole time, clearly visible through the branches, until it wasn't. Now, no matter which way I looked, I saw the same thing. Tall black trees, gray skies, and a sea of unblemished white snow. My father's footprints, too, had disappeared. A sense of vertigo washed over me. Without the footprints to guide me, I had no way of knowing which way I had come, or which way I was going. The road might have been just a 5-minute walk away, but I might become lost for days if I went the wrong direction. I forced myself to take control of my breathing and think. The sun had been on my left when I was heading into the forest, so if I keep it on my right while I walk back, I would surely find my way back to the road eventually, right? Half an hour later, however, I had only succeeded in going deeper into the Elijah Corvin woods. Those ancient trees looked even more sinister in the gloomy light of the setting sun, and I shivered in my cheap puffer jacket. It had been just fine when waiting to get into a club on a chilly night downtown, but out here, in the true dead of winter, it was almost useless. A burst of color flashed on the edge of my vision. Something red hung from a dead stump just a few feet ahead. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I approached it. My father's winter coat. I would have recognized that faded, stained, old thing anywhere. I had teased him so many times about it, trying to convince him to get a new one. But it was below freezing out here. Why would he have taken off his coat? The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something peering at me from behind a tree about 10 feet away. I thought I caught a glimpse of wide, insane eyes and a grinning mouthful of teeth, but by the time I turned around completely, whatever it was had gone. Had I just imagined it? I shook my head and told myself to keep moving. I wanted to call out to my father, but it seemed like a bad idea to break the silence. A dangerous idea.
Richard.
The voice that had spoken my name was so close that I could feel its rotten breath on my cheek. I cried out and swung instinctively, but my fist passed through empty air. So far, I had been able to blame my unsettling experience on being a nervous city kid with overwhelmingly active imagination. No more. There was something very, very wrong in the Elijah Corvin woods. I started to run. I knew it was a bad idea to move too quickly while lost in the wilderness, but I had to get away from that ragged coat and that awful whispering voice. The sky overhead grew darker. I kept snagging my clothes on branches and stumbling over roots. I had the strangest sensation that the forest was grabbing for me, trying to root me into place until I was dead and hollow as the stump where I'd found my father's jacket. I tried to push that disturbing thought out of my mind, but there was no denying it. The trees were so close together, the cold air was thick with the reek of dead leaves and rot. Just when I thought I couldn't take it for another minute, a clearing opened up ahead of me beneath the wide open sky, almost like it was meant for me. I gave a shout and ran out into the field of barren snow. If I hadn't tripped over the hiking boot, I would have never known it was there. Like the jacket, it had been my father's. Its twin lay just a few feet ahead. The thought of my old man out there somewhere, barefoot, uncovered, and alone, sent a shiver up my spine. I was halfway across the clearing before I realized that it wasn't a field at all. I was in the middle of a small, frozen pond. The ice groaned beneath my feet as I walked, and I already knew what would happen if it gave way. A sudden plunge into black, freezing water, fingers slipping helplessly on the ice as I sank, and maybe, just maybe, cold fingers that would reach up to pull me under. The rest of my father's clothes lay strewn in a path that pointed like an arrow to the far side of the pond. Was it a sign? And if so, who had left it? With nothing better to go on, I followed the trail of crumpled clothes. I paused every time I heard a crack beneath my feet, and when I did, I would have sworn I heard something scraping and thumping against the ice beneath me. A figure took shape in the darkness ahead. At first I thought it was a bent, twisted dead tree, but I had never seen a tree that was so warped looking and pale. Its twin branches looked almost like arms, the twigs like long, horribly stretched fingers, and was the stuff covered in bark or skin? Before I could stop myself, I reached out to touch it. An eye opened in its weird bark-like flesh. A greenish-blue iris looked my way, and I realized that I recognized it. I was looking at my father's eye. With a sound like splintering wood, the abomination in front of me attempted to speak, a warning or maybe a scream. The shock of it made me fall backwards, ice cracked beneath my weight. The noise made whatever was beneath the ice start clawing even more rapidly, and that wasn't all. There was movement in the woods. Now, dozens of voices were calling my name, and the frozen pond was truly beginning to shatter. Frigid water washed over my fingers as I scrambled onto dry land and ran. Black, ragged silhouettes pursued me through the trees, goading me on, their long, stick-like fingers always just barely grazing my skin. They weren't trying to kill me, I realized. They just wanted me to get too exhausted, so I couldn't move anymore. Maybe then, my toes would begin to dig into the hard, snowy ground. Maybe then, my spine would snap as my arms reached skyward, my fingers splitting into twigs. Maybe then, I would finally be as much a part of the Elijah Corvin woods as they were, as my father was. Briars scrapped against my face and winter air burned my lungs, but I couldn't let myself stop. No matter what, I could not stop. I was close to passing out when I noticed something had changed. The ground beneath my feet was flat and even, and wherever I was, it was out in the open. The whisperers had fallen behind, but I knew they were there, keeping pace with me at the edge of the forest, waiting. I thought I knew what had stopped them. A pair of lights, like glowing white eyes, were barreling towards me, moving impossibly fast. Behind those twin lights came a monstrous shape, ready to crush me in its jaws. It was too much. There was no way I could escape this. I covered my eyes and hurled myself into a snowbank, just seconds before the semi-truck blasted by. By sheer luck, I had made it back to the road. The first 2 cars that passed didn't stop for me. By sheer luck, I had made it back to the road. The first 2 cars didn't stop for me, and I couldn't blame them. There I was, ghost pale and covered with bleeding wounds, standing at the edge of a dark forest. It was another trucker who finally braked for me, and when I climbed up into his cab, he told me it was only because I looked like I was about to die of hyperthermia, and he didn't want that on his conscience. The locals, he said, had warned him to ignore any strange things he saw on the stretch of the road that passed by the Elijah Corvin woods. As it turned out, the trucker wasn't far from wrong. If he hadn't picked me up, there's no way I would have survived another hour. I had a bad case of frostbite, coupled with shock and exhaustion. I was in the hospital for weeks. I later learned that the night shift nurses hated being assigned to me because I screamed in my sleep. Apparently, I would claw at the bed and shriek about how I needed to sink my roots into the ground, but I don't remember any of that. All I remember are the trees, foreboding and hungry, their limbs rising over my body like a twisted crown. I know that I shouldn't want to return to that awful place, but I felt its pull ever since I left the hospital. The dreams keep getting more intense, and I know that one day soon, it won't be a dream. I'll wake up and I'll really be back there, surrounded by a circle of ragged figures, while I dig my bare feet into the sweet, nourishing earth of the Elijah Corvin woods.